The sublime, a greatness with which nothing else can be compared. The sublime, beyond all possibility of calculation, measurement, or imitation. The sublime, set or raised aloft. The sublime, pleasure from perceiving objects that threaten to hurt or destroy the observer. The sublime, pleasure from knowledge of the observer's nothingness and oneness with nature. The sublime, a quality of greatness or vast magnitude.
The idea of the selection behind Gallery 9 was not just to think about the individual works and interpret them for the public, was actually to think of it as an installation of nearly 40 works of art. And you actually saw it as a complete room. And that was the idea behind the wall colour, a kind of neutral shade that would unite all the works together so they wouldn't be isolated out from each other but could be viewed literally as one decorative scheme. The comment that comes up again and again is the idea of infinity, immensity, grandeur, magnitude, so enormity. So one would imagine that any work of art trying to engage with the sublime would be enormous. Its scale is important. Indeed, in Gallery 9, there are enormous canvases. I mean, you think of something like Goredale Scar by James Ward, which, when it was exhibited, was amazing to people going along to the Royal Academy because they simply hadn't seen a landscape painted so big. Now, on the other hand, we have William Blake's Ghost of a Flea, which is a tiny painting. I mean, it's really minuscule. It's like a miniature. But when you go from the grand, in other words, you're standing back and looking at something enormous, and then you focus in on something really tiny, I think that too has a kind of sublimity about it because you're having to really narrow down and think about what you're looking at. And the flea is literally Blake showing us this figure that came to him. Blake envisaged this thing as a monster in miniature. The flea is telling Blake that the reason why the fleas are created really, really small is if they were on the same kind of grandeur of scale of human beings, that they would literally suck the blood from everybody. And what's really amazing is this kind of grandeur of Blake's imagination, that these things might be physically small, but the vision is enormous. So what really interested me about Douglas in particular is that he's an artist who's very sensitive to a specific site. In fact, he responds to the site. And he told me that when he was at the Glasgow School of Art, he and his tutor actually had a debate about how much a location had an impact on the final work of art. And his tutor said it was 50-50 location to work of art, and he thought it might be 30-70, in that 70% was the work of art. But actually, it does underline the fact that the location is tremendously powerful.
It's the way that your eyes are kind of like drawn all over the space. The way you move around the space is probably different than you would conventionally move around it, like a gallery space. I really enjoy text on buildings. I like graffiti, and I often wish that graffiti was kind of more lyrical or more poetic, because I like the way that text on buildings draws you into the architecture. It kind of links thoughts with environment.
Normally what happens in that space is, especially in the Devines, because it's a series of sculpture galleries, is that people literally fill the space with a sculpture. And Douglas said that he, at one point, thought that maybe that's what he would do, is actually fill the space. And then he thought, no, actually, I don't have to fill this. I can fill it in another way, I can actually use the architecture and animate it with the texts. He uses Bembo, which is a font that he likes because it has kind of authority. It's a very ancient, sort of well-liked text, well-used text, but one that seems to have a slightly declamatory quality to it, or would suit an inscription in the inside of a dome of a church, or it just has an authority about it. So it looks like a quotation from the Bible or something rather hefty, something kind of heavyweight. And that's why he uses that text. So again, he's doing a sort of textual equivalent, I suppose, of John Martin's visuals. He's actually trying to get that sense of grandeur in the text themselves, just by the font that he's chosen. Is Douglas playing with us a little bit? You know, we're expecting to look up, physically do a sublime thing, which is to look up into the air, into a dome which has all these amazing religious resonances when you think of mosques and cathedrals, to read an inscription that's supposed to elevate us. And then you've got, you know, a line from the Rolling Stones. It's kind of playful, actually. It's kind of fun. But then maybe he's saying, well, it depends if you know the song by the Rolling Stones, because if you don't, maybe you'll think of it as grand and elevated. So I think he's being quite playful with what people expect, but also what people bring to a text themselves will depend on that individual.
The way they're placed, they're just overpowering. You get that feeling of awe being on infinity and finite. When I was looking at the avalanche, because I thought the avalanche had that same power of being vulnerable as a human and seeing the awe of nature when it just overtakes you. And then coming back to the deluge, you just feel that it's going to come straight over you, don't you? The rain and the storm. When I came out to look at this, I really like the fact that you have to look up and you've got the big text and the big dome, and I could hear the music of the Rolling Stones. And then the different size text is as if there's a different volume of people speaking to you, and the artist paces you by you either having to read backwards or forwards, and different size letters. And then going back in to look at the paintings, then I was much more aware of the potential sound from the paintings of the volcano or Vesuvius, or the water of the deluge. So I think this highlights thinking about sound.
For grandeur produces ecstasy rather than persuasion in the hearer, and the combination of wonder and astonishment always proves superior to the merely persuasive and pleasant. This is because persuasion is, on the whole, something we can control, whereas amazement and wonder exert invincible power and force and get the better of every hearer. Experience in invention and ability to order and arrange material cannot be detected in single passages. We begin to appreciate them only when we see the whole context. Sublimity, on the other hand, tears everything up like a whirlwind and exhibits the orator's whole power at a single blow.
People caught up in avalanches, volcanic eruptions, storms at sea, all these major natural catastrophes are very relevant now. I think once people get into the idea that even though you're dealing with a work of art that may be several centuries old, we are all human beings. And actually, if these experiences are universal, it means that they are also relevant to the past, present, and the future. And of course, If one was being controversial, one of the great sublime spectacles of recent times is the destruction of the Twin Towers in New York. And it does chime with much of the contents of Gallery 9. The other aspect that I think is relevant today is to think about the Sublime in terms of entertainment, because there's no doubt that artists like John Martin were forerunners of cinema. But they are the direct forefathers of the great biblical cinema films, the films that were engaged with the Old and New Testament. So there's a direct relationship there. But also the idea of the disaster movie. I mean, how many have there been which imagines the end of the world or some sort of great, disaster? And there's others engaging with climate change, or yet again, someone wanted to blow the planet up or something which clearly is of enormous interest to the cinema-going public, and thus very relevant in terms of the Sublime. Because after all, people sit down and they watch a movie. They may get absorbed, may be terrified, they may be shocked, but actually at the end of the day, they get up and they walk out of the cinema. So there is a kind of pleasurable terror that's being experienced, but you know that you will walk out of the cinema, and that is the Sublime.